At 18, my parents threw me out into a winter storm for getting pregnant by a man they called a worthless plumber. His blue-collar job will disgrace our family, my mother screamed, locking the door in my face. My boyfriend did not flinch. We married in a courthouse without a single relative attending. For 15 years, my family pretended I was dead, erasing me from their lives. Until last night, when my mother showed up at my door shaking, sobbing, and demanding money to save the empire she used to crush me. What she did not know was that the boy she called a worthless plumber now ran a multi-million-dollar commercial company, and we were holding the deed to her reputation. Before I continue, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever stood up to a toxic family member. The evening started quietly at our home. My husband Isaiah was in the kitchen showing our 15-year-old son Malik how to sear a steak. The house was filled with the smell of garlic mixed with their laughter echoing off the vaulted ceilings. I was sitting at the kitchen island reviewing quarterly financial reports for our company. We had worked relentlessly to build our lives from nothing. We went from scraping together coins for rent in a studio apartment to designing our own custom estate. Then the heavy knocker on our door echoed through the foyer. It was sharp and frantic. Isaiah paused, exchanging a confused look with me. We were not expecting guests, and the security gate rarely let anyone through without calling first. I walked down the wide hallway. Through the frosted glass panels, I could see the frantic silhouette of a woman pacing. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. The freezing night air rushed into the foyer, but the chill was nothing compared to the ice that settled in my veins when I realized who was standing on my porch. It was my mother, Brenda. She looked entirely out of place. Her designer coat was soaked from the rain, and her expensive blowout was ruined with wet strands plastered to her face. But the most jarring thing was the look on her face when she looked past me. Her eyes darted from the imported marble floors to the massive crystal chandelier hanging from the high ceiling. For a split second, her panic was replaced by raw shock. She had spent the last 15 years telling everyone in her country club circle that I was living in a trailer park scrubbing toilets to support a deadbeat husband. The reality of my success hit her like a physical blow, but my mother was resilient in her arrogance. She composed her face, pushing her shoulders back, adopting that familiar haughty posture I had hated my entire life. "Jada," she said, her voice sharp and demanding, devoid of maternal warmth. "Let me inside, it is freezing out here." She did not wait for an invitation. She pushed past me, her wet boots leaving muddy footprints on my immaculate floors. The audacity of her marching into my home after 15 years of silence left me speechless. I closed the door. Isaiah and Malik had stepped out of the kitchen, hearing the commotion. Malik stood tall in his school uniform, having returned from his private academy earlier. He looked exactly like Isaiah, but with my eyes. He was the baby my mother had called a mistake and a stain on our family name. Now he was an honor roll student standing in front of her. My mother stopped dead in her tracks when she saw them. She looked at Isaiah, taking in his tailored casual clothes, and then her eyes shifted to Malik. I waited to see if a grandmotherly instinct would kick in. I waited to see if she would recognize the young man or show an ounce of remorse for throwing him out. Instead, she rolled her eyes and let out a heavy, dramatic sigh. She looked away from Malik as if he was unwanted furniture. "Send the boy to his room," she commanded, pointing a manicured finger toward the stairs. "I do not have time for pleasantries, and I am not here to play family reunion. I need to speak to you alone, Jada. This is an emergency regarding your father and his medical clinic." Malik clenched his jaw but kept his composure perfectly. He looked at me, waiting for my lead. Isaiah took a protective step forward, his broad shoulders tense, his expression hard. "Malik is not going anywhere," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "You do not get to barge into my home after 15 years, track mud across my floor, and give orders under my roof. If you have something to say, you say it in front of my husband and my son. Or you can walk back out into the rain." My mother scoffed, crossing her arms over her chest. She looked at Isaiah with sheer disgust. "Fine," she snapped. If you want to air family business in front of the help, that is your choice. Your father is being audited. The clinic is going under and they are threatening to seize his assets. We need $50,000 by Monday morning to keep the auditors at bay. I know your husband does not make that kind of money fixing toilets, but you are going to take out a loan. You owe your father for raising you. I just stared at her, letting the absolute absurdity of her ridiculous demand hang heavily in the cold air. She genuinely thought she could walk right in here, insult my loving husband, ignore my child, and demand $50,000 like it was her given birthright. A very cold smile slowly spread across my face. She wanted a quick bailout, but she was about to get a very brutal wake-up call. I looked at my mother standing dripping wet on my imported rug and let out a laugh that had no humor in it. $50,000. I repeated slowly, letting the number hang in the air. You drove all the way out here in a storm after ignoring my existence for a decade and a half to demand $50,000. My mother reached into her designer leather handbag. Her hands were shaking as she pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. She shoved it toward my chest, but I did not reach out to take it. The paper fluttered and landed on the marble floor between us. "Pick it up, Jada," she ordered, her voice rising in pitch. "Your father is facing a massive tax audit, and the clinic is drowning. The bank has already transferred our debt to a third-party collection agency. If we do not pay the balance by Monday morning, they are going to freeze our accounts. Do you have any idea what that will do to our reputation at the country club? People are already whispering." I stared at the crumpled paper on the floor, and then looked back up at her. "Reputation?" I asked quietly. "You are about to lose your livelihood, and you are worried about the country club gossip." She crossed her arms, defensive and angry. "You would not understand," she snapped. "You threw away your future when you decided to lay down with a lowly plumber." She turned her venomous gaze toward Isaiah, who had not moved an inch. "Look at him," she sneered. "I bet he does not even know what a portfolio is. We spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on your private school education so you could marry a doctor or a lawyer. Instead, you ran off with a man who fixes toilets for a living. I am sure he is perfectly fine living paycheck to paycheck, but your father and I have a legacy to maintain. So tell your husband to go to the bank and take out a loan against this house. It is the least you can do to repay us for the shame you brought to our family." The silence in the foyer was deafening. Malik stepped closer to his father, but Isaiah gently put a hand on his shoulder, calming him. Isaiah stepped forward. He did not yell. He did not look intimidated. He looked at my mother the way one might look at a stray dog making a mess on the lawn. "Brenda," Isaiah began, his voice deep and completely steady, "I do not fix toilets anymore. In fact, I have not touched a wrench in 10 years. But even when I did, I earned every single dollar with my own 2 hands. I never had to steal. I never had to beg. And I certainly never had to show up at the home of a child I abandoned to demand money to save my fragile ego." My mother gasped, clutching her chest as if she had been physically struck. "How dare you speak to me that way?" she hissed. "You are nothing but blue-collar trash. You got lucky buying this house, probably with some subprime mortgage you cannot afford. You do not know anything about real wealth." Isaiah just smiled, a slow, chilling smile. "Real wealth. Brenda is not carrying a $10,000 bag while your bank account is overdrawn. Real wealth is not begging your estranged daughter to bail out your husband because he does not know how to manage a medical practice. You are standing in a house that is fully paid off. There is no mortgage. And my company holds contracts worth more than your husband could make in 10 lifetimes. So before you insult my profession, you might want to ask yourself why the plumber is the one standing here debt-free while the doctor's wife is begging on my floor." My mother turned bright red. Her jaw trembled with pure rage. She turned to me, expecting me to put my husband in his place. "Jada," she yelled, "are you going to let him talk to your mother this way? You sign the check right now, or I swear to heaven you will never be welcome in our family again. I will make sure Aaliyah and your father cut you off forever." I slowly bent down and picked up the crumpled paper from the floor. I smoothed out the wrinkles, taking my time. It was a final notice of default. The medical supply company my father used had sold his past due invoices to a debt buyer. I read the numbers. It was not just an audit, it was a complete financial failure. "Cut me off," I asked softly. "Mom, you cut me off 15 years ago. You told me I was dead to you. You changed the locks on the house. You did not even come to the hospital when Malik was born premature. You have nothing left to take from me." I looked down at the paper again, focusing on the name of the collection agency at the top of the letterhead. A deep sense of poetic justice washed over me. I tapped my manicured fingernail against the paper. "Mom," I said, holding the letter up to her face, "do you know who owns Apex Commercial Recovery?" She blinked, confused by the sudden change in topic. "What does that matter?" she snapped impatiently. "They are blood-sucking vultures. They bought your father's debt for pennies on the dollar, and now they are threatening to liquidate the clinic assets. That is why I need the 50,000. I took a step closer to her, lowering my voice so she had to strain to hear me. "They are not blood-sucking vultures, Mom. They are a very successful subsidiary firm. We buy bad debt from medical supply companies and we restructure it for a profit. It is a very lucrative business." She stared at me, her eyes darting back and forth as my words slowly registered in her panicked brain. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. "That is right," I whispered, handing the paper back to her. "Apex Commercial Recovery is a holding company. My holding company. I am the Chief Operating Officer and Isaiah is the Chief Executive Officer. The man you just called a lowly plumber does not just own this house. He owns your husband's debt. We are the ones threatening to liquidate the clinic." The color completely drained from her face. She looked like she was going to faint right there in my foyer. Her hands started trembling so violently that the paper shook. "You," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "This is a lie. You cannot do this. You are my daughter. I am the plumber's wife." I corrected her, my voice turning to pure ice. "And as the owner of your debt, I am officially denying your request for an extension. You have until Monday morning to pay the $50,000 in full. If the money is not wired into my account by 9 o'clock, I will personally sign the order to seize every piece of medical equipment in that clinic. Now get out of my house before I call the police and have you arrested for trespassing." My mother stumbled backward as if the floor had suddenly tilted beneath her feet. She looked at the piece of paper in her trembling hands, and then up at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. She tried to speak, but only a pathetic sputtering sound escaped her lips. The arrogant society woman who had marched into my home minutes ago was completely gone. In her place stood a desperate, terrified stranger who finally realized she had walked directly into a trap she could not escape. Isaiah stepped up beside me, wrapping a warm, strong arm around my waist. He looked at the woman who had spent a decade and a half mocking his name. "We will be expecting the wire transfer, Brenda," he said calmly. "Have a safe drive back in the rain." She did not say another word. She could not. She turned around, her wet coat swishing heavily around her legs, and practically ran toward the heavy oak door. She fumbled with the handle, her hands shaking too much to open it on the first try. When she finally pulled it open, she stumbled out into the freezing storm without looking back. I stood there in the warm glow of my beautiful home, watching her taillights fade down our long private driveway. The silence that settled over the house was peaceful. Malik looked at me, a small, proud smile on his face. I squeezed my husband's hand, feeling the rough calluses that had built our empire. The war had just begun, but we had already won the first battle. I closed the heavy oak door and slid the deadbolt into place. The solid click echoed in the quiet foyer. Isaiah let out a deep breath and ran a hand over his face. He looked at me, his dark eyes full of a quiet storm. "She is not going to tell your father the truth," he said, his voice low. "She is going to drive straight to your sister Aaliyah and spin a story about how we threatened her. She will play the victim. Let her. I replied, walking back toward the kitchen. They have spent 15 years living in a fantasy world where they are untouchable and we are nothing. The reality is about to hit them very hard. Malik followed us into the kitchen. He grabbed his backpack from one of the bar stools. I am going upstairs to finish my history essay, he said. But he paused before leaving the room. He wrapped his arms around me in a tight hug. I am proud of you, Mom. You did not let her disrespect Dad. I kissed his forehead. Nobody disrespects this family, Malik. Nobody. He smiled and headed up the stairs. Isaiah walked back over to the stove and looked at the steaks resting on the cutting board. Dinner is delayed, he said, turning the burner back on. But I think we have lost our appetite for a quiet evening. I sat down at the kitchen island and pulled my tablet toward me. I opened the secure portal for Apex Commercial Recovery and pulled up my father's file. It was worse than I thought. My father had been treating his medical clinic like a personal cash machine for years. He was taking out business loans to pay for country club memberships, luxury vacations, and leased sports cars. He was bleeding the practice dry to maintain the illusion of high society wealth. $50,000 by Monday, Isaiah said, leaning against the marble counter. He crossed his arms, watching me scroll through the financial statements. Do you remember when we could not even scrape together $50 to pay the heating deposit in our first apartment? I looked up from the screen, the memory flashing instantly in my mind. It was the week after they threw me out. The snow was piled high against the windows of that tiny drafty studio we rented. I remembered the biting cold. I remember wearing 3 pairs of socks and 2 sweaters sitting on a mattress on the floor because we could not afford a bed frame. I held my pregnant belly, terrified of the future, while you worked a double shift fixing frozen pipes in the city. Isaiah nodded, his expression hardening. I came home at 3 in the morning, covered in grease and freezing water. You were awake under a pile of cheap blankets, reading a textbook on corporate accounting. You looked at me with those tired eyes and told me we were going to build something bigger than my tool bag. And we did, I said quietly. You took the money from those late-night emergency calls and bought that rusted-out van. You worked until your hands bled. And while you were under commercial sinks, I was sitting on that same mattress on the floor making cold calls to property managers. I handled your contracts, I managed the billing, and I learned every loophole in corporate tax law. We built a commercial plumbing and operations empire, one contract at a time. My mother drove past our street in her Mercedes every Sunday on her way to church. Isaiah said, his voice thick with a lingering bitterness. She knew exactly where we lived. She knew you had just given birth to Malik. She never once stopped. She never knocked on the door to see if her grandson had formula or a warm blanket. She just kept driving because being seen in our neighborhood would ruin her pristine image. They thought my life was over, I said, tapping the screen of my tablet. My father told me I was dead weight. He said a blue-collar worker like you would drag me into a life of poverty and misery. He was so blinded by his own arrogance that he could not see the work ethic of the man standing right in front of him. You studied local business codes at night while he was out drinking expensive scotch at the golf course. You secured state government contracts while he was taking out high-interest loans to buy custom suits. Isaiah walked around the island and stood behind my chair, resting his large, warm hands on my shoulders. His touch was grounding. It was the same touch that had kept me sane during the darkest days of my life. And now, he said, looking at the financial reports glowing on the screen, your holding company owns the debt that is going to sink his entire fake empire. You hold the keys to his clinic, Jada. What is the next move? I leaned back against him, looking at the massive negative numbers on my father's balance sheet. My mother is panicked, I said. But my father and my sister Aaliyah will never believe her. They will think she is exaggerating. They still think I am the terrified 18-year-old girl crying in the snow. They do not know about Apex, and they do not know about the corporate lawyers we have on retainer. Tomorrow is Sunday. I continued, my voice steady and cold. My father, Aaliyah, and her pompous husband, Preston, always have brunch at the country club at noon. It is a family tradition. The same tradition they banned me from 15 years ago. Are you going to crash their brunch? Isaiah asked, a slow, knowing smile spreading across his face. I am not going to crash it, I replied, turning off the tablet. I am going to join them. I need to look my father in the eye. I need to see the exact moment he realizes that the daughter he threw away like trash is the only person on earth who can save him from losing everything. And I need to remind my perfect sister that she is not as untouchable as she thinks. Isaiah leaned down and kissed my cheek. Do you want me to come with you? I shook my head. No. If you are there, Preston will just use your presence to make cheap, snide remarks and deflect from the real issue. I want them to look at me. I want them to see the woman they created. I am going to the country club alone, and I am bringing the legal notices with me. Isaiah stepped back and returned to the stove. Give them hell, Jada. I looked out the large kitchen window at the rain pouring down in the darkness. My mother was out there somewhere, probably frantically calling her country club friends to secure a secret loan. She was desperate. But desperation makes people reckless. Tomorrow I would walk into their world of crystal glasses and fake smiles, and I was going to tear it all down brick by brick. The next day the sun was shining brightly, completely erasing the storm from the night before. I pulled my car up to the valet stand at the Oakmont Country Club. The valet, a young kid with a crisp uniform, looked surprised when I stepped out of my new luxury sedan. He was used to seeing my father pulling up in his leased sports car, not me. I handed him the keys and walked through the heavy glass doors into the main dining room. The air inside smelled like expensive perfume, roasted lamb, and old money. It was the kind of place where people smiled at you while secretly calculating your net worth. I spotted them immediately. They were sitting at their usual table near the large bay windows overlooking the 18th hole. My father, Carlton, was wearing a crisp polo shirt, looking every bit the respected physician he pretended to be. My older sister, Aaliyah, sat perfectly postured next to him, looking like a country club advertisement in her silk blouse. Beside her sat her husband, Preston. My mother was noticeably absent. I walked slowly across the dining room, feeling the weight of their gaze as I approached the table. None of them stood up to greet me. Aaliyah looked me up and down, taking in my tailored suit, but her eyes still held that familiar disdain. She probably thought I bought it on clearance or rented it for the occasion. Well, look who decided to grace us with her presence, my father said, his voice dripping with condescension before I even sat down. Your mother is at home with a terrible migraine because of your little stunt last night. I pulled out a chair and sat down, signaling the passing waiter for a sparkling water. What stunt, Dad? I asked, calmly resting my hands on the white tablecloth. Refusing to hand over $50,000 to a woman who told me I was dead to her 15 years ago. Preston let out a short, mocking laugh. He took a sip of his drink, looking at me like I was a lost child who had wandered into the wrong neighborhood. I know your type, Jada, he continued. You get a little bit of credit, you lease a nice car to look the part, but underneath it all, you are still struggling to make ends meet. Brenda told us about the little show you and your husband put on. Playing pretend executives in the suburbs must be exhausting for you two. Isaiah probably works 50 hours a week just to keep the lights on. How is the plumbing business anyway? Did he manage to wash the grease off his hands before he touched the nice furniture you guys are clearly renting to impress us? I looked at Preston, keeping my face completely blank. He was a hedge fund manager who came from old money, but his eyes always held a predatory gleam. He loved throwing those little racial microaggressions at my husband, safely hidden behind his polite country club smile. He always acted like a hard-working black man in a blue-collar trade was somehow an amusing novelty to him. Isaiah is doing exceptionally well, I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level and refusing to take the bait. You would be surprised how much money there is in fixing the messes other people leave behind. Preston chuckled, shaking his head as if I had just told a cute joke. Right, well, manual labor builds character, I suppose. Someone has to do the dirty physical work, while the rest of us manage the real capital and keep the economy moving. My father cleared his throat loudly, cutting off the banter. He looked around to make sure none of his wealthy friends were listening to our conversation. "We are not here to talk about your husband, Jada," my father hissed, leaning closer to the table. "We are here to fix the mess you made. Your mother said you claimed to own the collection agency that is auditing my clinic. I assume that was just some pathetic lie your husband came up with to sound important and intimidate a distressed woman. But the fact remains that the clinic needs liquid capital by tomorrow morning. It is just a temporary cash flow issue. Since you apparently have enough credit to rent a nice house, we are going to use your name to secure a bridge loan." Aaliyah reached into her designer tote bag and pulled out a thick manila envelope. She slid it across the white tablecloth toward me. Her perfectly manicured nails tapped impatiently against the paper. "This is a financial power of attorney," she said, her voice sickly sweet and entirely fake. "Preston had his corporate legal team drafted up this morning. All you need to do is sign at the bottom line. It gives Dad the legal authority to leverage your credit history to secure a line of credit for the clinic. Do not worry, we will pay the monthly premiums. You just need to be the guarantor on paper. It is the least you can do." I looked at the thick envelope and then up at my sister. "You want me to give you financial control over my name?" I asked, my tone dangerously quiet. Aaliyah rolled her eyes, dropping the sweet act instantly. "Do not act like this is a huge sacrifice, Jada," she snapped. "You owe this family everything. We paid for your entire childhood. You ruined our pristine reputation when you got pregnant by a mechanic and got kicked out of the house. You humiliated Dad in front of all his colleagues. This is your chance to finally make things right and be useful for once in your life." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, holding her gaze until she blinked. "Useful," I repeated softly. "Like how you were useful when my water broke in the middle of a blizzard 15 years ago." The entire table went silent, but I kept going. "I came to your apartment begging for a ride to the hospital because our heat was shut off and the roads were frozen solid. You opened the door, took one look at me, and threw my hospital bag out into the snow. You told me not to bleed on your imported rug and slammed the door in my face. You told me I was a disgrace." My father slammed his hand on the table, rattling the silver cutlery. "Keep your voice down," he hissed, looking frantically around at the neighboring tables to see if anyone was watching us. "This is not about this past. This is about family duty. I am your father, and I gave you life. You will pick up a pen and sign that document right now." I slowly picked up the envelope, holding it lightly between my fingers. "I am not signing anything," I said, my voice dropping to a cold, absolute whisper. "I do not owe you my credit. I do not owe you my money. And I certainly do not owe you my name." I tossed the envelope back across the table. It slid smoothly over the white linen and bumped against his expensive Scotch glass. My father turned purple with rage, his jaw clenched so hard I thought his teeth might shatter. Aaliyah let out a dramatic sigh and crossed her arms, looking at Preston for backup. Preston suddenly laughed, breaking the tense silence. It was a cold, calculating sound that made my skin crawl. He leaned across the table, his pale blue eyes locking onto mine. He looked entirely too pleased with himself, like a snake cornering a mouse. "You really think you have a choice here?" he asked smoothly, a dark threat lingering just beneath his polite tone. I did not blink as I met Preston's gaze. "A choice," I repeated, letting the word roll off my tongue. "I am a grown woman standing in a free country with my own bank accounts and my own business. Of course I have a choice. I can stand up right now, walk out of those glass doors, and never look back at any of you." Aaliyah laughed, a harsh, grating sound that drew the attention of an older couple at the next table. "You really are clueless, Jada," she said, shaking her head. Her perfectly styled hair caught the light from the chandelier, making her look like a plastic doll. "You come in here wearing a nice suit trying to play the big corporate boss, but you do not understand how the real world works. Family is tied together. You cannot just sever those ties because your feelings got hurt 15 years ago. Dad is the patriarch. He makes the financial decisions to keep this family afloat, and sometimes that requires a little creative maneuvering." Creative maneuvering, I asked, my stomach suddenly tightening. A warning bell went off in my mind, ringing loud and clear. The smugness on their faces was not just arrogant entitlement. It was the dark confidence of people who believed they held a winning hand in a rigged game. I looked at my father. He was staring out the large window at the manicured golf course, refusing to meet my eyes. His jaw was clenched tight. His silence was absolutely deafening. Preston folded his hands together, resting them smoothly on the white tablecloth. He leaned closer, lowering his voice so only our table could hear over the soft clinking of silverware in the dining room. The truth is, Jada, we do not actually need your signature on that power of attorney, he said, a sickening smile spreading across his pale face. It would be convenient, sure. It would make the local bank paperwork move a little faster today, but it is not strictly necessary. I frowned, gripping the edge of the table until my knuckles turned white. What are you talking about? We already have an established line of credit in your name. Preston explained, his tone as casual as if he were discussing the weather forecast. 5 years ago, when the clinic hit its first little speed bump, your father came to me for advice. He needed a quick injection of capital, but his personal debt-to-income ratio was a bit too high for the commercial lenders. We needed a clean social security number to act as the primary borrower for a new corporate entity. The air in my lungs turned to solid ice. My social security number, I whispered. You used my social security number. Preston shrugged, picking up his expensive drink again. Your father had it in his old tax files in the attic. It was incredibly easy, actually. We took out a $200,000 business loan. I managed the funds through my hedge fund to generate some returns for the clinic, while your father made the minimum monthly payments to keep the account in good standing. We assumed you would never even notice. After all, you and your plumber husband were probably just dealing in cash and scraping by week to week. We figured a poor blue-collar family would never have the need to run a comprehensive credit check for a mortgage or a major investment. You do not exactly need an 800 credit score to buy wrenches and pipe tape. I sat completely paralyzed, listening to the absolute monster sitting across from me freely admit to a massive financial crime. My own father had stolen my identity. He had taken my name, the only thing I had left, when he threw me out into the winter cold, and used it to fraudulently borrow hundreds of thousands of dollars to fund his fake high society lifestyle. I turned my head slowly and looked at the man who had helped create me. The man who was supposed to protect me. You stole my identity. I whispered the words, feeling heavy and toxic on my tongue. You committed financial fraud against your own daughter. My father finally looked at me, his eyes hard and completely unrepentant. Do not use such dramatic words, he snapped, adjusting the silver cufflinks on his tailored shirt. It was a family loan. I gave you life, Jada. I fed you and clothed you for 18 years. You cost me hundreds of thousands of dollars in private school tuition, piano lessons, and medical bills. Using your credit score was simply a return on my investment. You owed me. You think because you ran off and played house with a mechanic that your debt to this family was erased. I am simply taking back what is rightfully mine. Besides, I made the payments on time for years. It is only recently that the accounts fell a little behind. Aaliyah leaned forward, tapping the manila envelope again with her long fingernail. That is why you need to sign this new document, Jada. You are already on the hook for the $200,000. If the clinic goes under and Dad defaults on that loan, the banks will come directly after you. Your credit will be completely destroyed. You and Isaiah will not be able to buy a used car, let alone keep renting whatever house you are living in. You are trapped. We are in the same boat now, so you might as well sign this and help us bail out the water. The sheer audacity of their plan was staggering. They had created a massive financial sinkhole using my name, and now they were using the threat of my own destruction to force me into total compliance. They thought I was a helpless pawn. They thought I was an ignorant, uneducated girl who would panic at the thought of a ruined credit score and blindly sign away whatever rights I had left just to save myself from bankruptcy. But they had made one fatal miscalculation. They had no idea who I really was. They had no idea that Isaiah and I ran comprehensive background checks on ourselves annually as part of our corporate compliance protocols. We had actually discovered the fraudulent account years ago. Our legal team had advised us to let it sit quietly while they built an airtight case against the creditors to prove it was a fraudulent origination. We had been waiting for the right moment to strike to find out exactly who had signed the forged documents. And now Preston had just handed me the full verbal confession on a silver platter. The freezing numbness in my chest vanished instantly, replaced by a burning, soaring sense of absolute clarity. I did not scream. I did not flip the table. I did not cry. I slowly pushed my chair back and stood up from the table. I smoothed down the front of my tailored suit jacket, making sure my posture was absolutely perfect. "Where are you going?" Aaliyah demanded, her smug smile faltering just a fraction at my complete lack of panic. "Sit down, Jada." My father ordered, his voice harsh and commanding. "We are not finished here." "Oh, we are finished, Dad," I said, looking down at him with a level of pure disgust I had never felt before. "You really thought you were the smartest person in the room, did you not? You thought you could steal my name and hold it hostage to save your country club membership. But you forgot one very important detail." Preston narrowed his eyes, staring at me intently. "And what detail is that?" he asked, his voice losing some of its cocky, confident edge. I looked right into his pale blue eyes and offered him a devastatingly polite smile. "Fraud of over $100,000 is a federal felony, Preston. And when the FBI investigates wire fraud, they do not care about family duty or country club memberships. They care about paper trails." I picked up my clutch from the table and looked at the three of them one last time, taking in their sudden confusion. "You did not trap me today," I said, my voice ringing with absolute crystal clear authority. "You just dug your own graves. Enjoy your lunch." I turned my back on them and walked toward the exit, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished hardwood floor. I did not look back, but I could feel their eyes burning into my spine. They were still sitting at their expensive table, drinking their expensive drinks, pretending to be the masters of the universe. But as I pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the bright afternoon sunlight, I knew the absolute truth. They were already dead in the water, and I was going to be the one to pull the plug. I reached my car and the valet held the door open for me. I slipped into the driver's seat and immediately connected my phone to the Bluetooth system. I did not drive away right away. I sat there in the quiet luxury of the cabin, watching the front doors of the country club. I pulled up my contacts and dialed the direct line for our lead corporate attorney, Jonathan. He was a former federal prosecutor who now headed the legal division for Apex, and he did not lose cases. Jonathan answered on the second ring. I told him the waiting period was officially over. I told him my father and my brother-in-law Preston had just verbally confessed to the fraudulent loan origination from 5 years ago. I heard the sound of a keyboard clacking on his end of the line immediately. He asked if I was ready to authorize the forensic accounting team to pull the trigger on the full investigation. I told him to authorize it all and spare absolutely no expense. I wanted every wire transfer, every bank statement, and every forged signature pulled and verified by the time I reached the office. As I pulled out of the country club parking lot, I thought about the stark contrast between us. My father and Aaliyah were probably still sitting at that table, ordering another round of expensive drinks on a tab they could not afford. They operated on petty manipulation and small-town gossip. They thought wealth was about wearing the right silk blouse and having a membership at a golf course. They had absolutely no idea what actual corporate warfare looked like. They were playing checkers, while Isaiah and I had spent the last 15 years building a fortress. It took me 45 minutes to drive from the country club to the downtown headquarters of Apex Commercial Services. Our building was a sleek glass tower that Isaiah and I had purchased 2 years ago. When I walked onto the executive floor, the atmosphere was already electric. Jonathan was waiting for me in the main conference room, along with our two senior forensic accountants. The large glass table was covered in file folders, and the digital projector was already displaying complex financial flowcharts on the wall. I set my bag down and took my seat at the head of the table. Jonathan did not waste any time with pleasantries. He handed me a thick stack of printed bank records. He explained that since the loan was taken out in my name, our legal team had full legal right to subpoena the origination documents from the bank. Because we had already laid the groundwork months ago, the bank compliance officers had handed over the files immediately upon our request. The power of a multi-million-dollar corporation demanding answers was vastly different from a panicked individual calling a customer service line. We looked at the original loan application projected on the wall. There it was. My social security number printed clearly at the top of the page, and at the bottom was a signature that was supposed to be mine. It was a decent forgery, but it was undeniably fake. Jonathan pointed out that the IP address used to submit the final digital paperwork traced back directly to a computer in my father's medical clinic. That alone was enough to prove wire fraud. We also had the digital timestamps showing the exact hour the application was submitted, matching a day I was out of state negotiating a massive plumbing contract for Isaiah. But we did not stop there. I told the accountants I wanted to know exactly where every single dollar of that $200,000 went. My father claimed he used it to keep his clinic afloat, but I knew him too well. He was vain and he was arrogant, but he was not sophisticated enough to structure a corporate bridge loan on his own. That had Preston's fingerprints all over it. For the next 3 hours, we sat in that conference room tracking the digital footprints. Our accounting team sliced through layers of bank routing numbers and shell company transfers. It was a masterclass in forensic accounting. We watched the money move from the initial bank disbursement into a holding account managed by my father's clinic. But the money did not stay there to pay for medical supplies or staff salaries. It did not go toward any legitimate business expenses that would help a struggling medical practice. Within 48 hours of the loan clearing, the entire $200,000 was wired out of the clinic account. It was sent through 2 different intermediary banks to mask the trail. To an amateur, it would look like a series of complex vendor payments. But to my team of elite accountants, it was a sloppy amateur attempt at money laundering. I stared at the screen as Jonathan traced the routing number of the final receiving account. I asked him who owned the destination account. The room was silent for a moment as the accountants cross-referenced the corporate registry database. When the name finally popped up on the screen, a cold wave of realization washed over me. The money had not gone to a medical supplier. It had not gone to a payroll company. The receiving account belonged to a private equity holding firm. It was a firm entirely owned and operated by Preston. Jonathan leaned back in his leather chair and took off his glasses. He looked at me with the sharp, focused gaze of a man who had just found the murder weapon. He explained that Preston had taken the fraudulent loan secured by my stolen identity and funneled it directly into his own failing hedge fund. He had used my father as a willing pawn to steal my credit score just to artificially inflate his own investment portfolio. My father had effectively sold my identity to his white son-in-law just to maintain the illusion of being part of the wealthy elite. It was a level of betrayal that went far beyond a desperate father trying to save his business. This was a calculated predatory theft orchestrated by the very man who had sat across from me at lunch and mocked my husband's blue-collar background. Preston had treated Isaiah like dirt while secretly surviving off money stolen from my name. He had the nerve to look down on manual labor while he was committing federal crimes to fund his expensive suits. I felt a cold, dangerous smile form on my lips. They had underestimated me so severely that it was almost embarrassing. They thought they had backed me into a corner with that power of attorney demand. Instead, they had just handed me the exact map I needed to destroy them completely. I told Jonathan to draft the official fraud reports for the federal authorities. We had the forged documents, we had the IP addresses, we had the wire transfers. I looked at the flowchart on the wall mapping out Preston's illegal financial network. I told my team to get everything finalized and legally certified because we were about to go hunting. I stood at the head of the conference table watching the digital projector illuminate the dark reality of my family's hidden life. The flowchart on the wall was a glowing web of deceit, and Preston was the spider sitting right in the center. Jonathan pulled up another set of documents on the screen. These were public filings and quarterly reports for Preston's private equity firm. I asked Jonathan to explain exactly how desperate my arrogant brother-in-law really was. Jonathan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He explained that Preston had been bleeding capital for the last 3 years. His fund was heavily over-leveraged in commercial real estate ventures that had completely tanked during the last market shift. To maintain his wealthy facade and keep his country club investors from pulling their money, Preston had started commingling funds. He was essentially running a sophisticated shell game, moving money from new accounts to cover the massive losses in old ones. When my father came to him whining about the clinic struggling, Preston did not see a family member in need. He saw a temporary lifeline for his own sinking ship. My father had handed Preston my social security number, thinking they were executing a clever little family loan to generate some quick returns for the medical practice. But Preston took that $200,000 and dumped it straight into his hedge fund. He embezzled the funds to cover a margin call on a terrible investment. The money was completely gone within 48 hours of the loan clearing. Preston had been making the minimum monthly payments on the loan out of his own pocket just to keep the bank from looking too closely at the origination files. But when his firm finally hit a massive liquidity crisis a few months ago, the payments stopped and the loan went into default, exposing the entire scheme. I crossed my arms, feeling a dark sense of absolute triumph settling over me. Preston had sat at that country club lunch acting like he was a titan of industry. He had looked down his nose at me and mocked my husband for working with his hands. Meanwhile, he was a desperate white-collar criminal drowning in debt and surviving entirely on stolen money. He had built his entire arrogant identity on a mountain of corporate fraud. And now I was holding the detonator that would blow his life apart. The conference room door opened and Isaiah walked in. He had driven straight over from a commercial site inspection. He was wearing his heavy work boots and a dark canvas jacket, looking like the hard-working man he was. He took off his hard hat and walked over to the table, looking at the financial documents scattered everywhere. I gave him a brief summary of what Jonathan and the accounting team had uncovered. I watched his eyes scan the flowchart on the projection screen, tracing the path of the stolen money from my name directly into Preston's failing hedge fund. Isaiah let out a low whistle, shaking his head in disbelief. "So the brilliant financial mastermind is just a common thief," he said, his voice laced with heavy irony. "He sat there this afternoon drinking top-shelf liquor and calling me a lowly plumber while he was secretly living off a fraudulent loan taken out in your name. That is a special kind of pathetic. He actually thought he was superior to us because he wears a suit to steal instead of wearing coveralls to build." I nodded, leaning against the edge of the glass table. "He has cornered Isaiah. If we hand this file over to the Securities and Exchange Commission right now, they will freeze all of his assets pending a federal investigation. His investors will panic and pull whatever capital they have left. The FBI will bring him up on wire fraud and identity theft charges. He will lose his firm, his house, and his precious country club membership. He will go to federal prison, and Aaliyah will be left with absolutely nothing." Jonathan spoke up from his seat. "We have everything we need to file the reports, Jada. The evidence is entirely bulletproof. We just need your authorization to submit the package to the federal authorities. Once we hit send, there is no going back. The investigation will be out of our hands and the dominoes will start falling on your family." I looked at the thick stack of papers on the table. It would be so easy to just say yes. I could destroy Preston and Aaliyah with a single word. I could watch their perfect plastic life crumble to dust, and I would not lose a single minute of sleep over it. But there was still one piece of the puzzle that was bothering me. My father. I needed to know how much my father actually knew. Did he know Preston had embezzled the money, or was he just a gullible fool who thought his son-in-law was a financial genius? My father had been the one to physically steal my social security number from his attic. He had been the one to forge my signature on the digital application. I needed to look him in the eye one more time before I burned his world down. I needed to see if he had even an ounce of regret, or if his arrogance ran so deep that it had completely blinded him to the monster he had brought into our family. I turned to Jonathan and told him to hold the federal reports for 24 hours. I wanted the dossier fully prepared and sitting on my desk, but I was not ready to pull the trigger just yet. Jonathan nodded, gathering the files and dismissing the forensic accounting team. They packed up their laptops, leaving Isaiah and me alone in the quiet conference room. Isaiah walked over and wrapped his arms around me, pulling me against his chest. "You are going to confront him, aren't you?" he asked softly, resting his chin on the top of my head. "You want to give your father one last chance to tell the truth." I closed my eyes, listening to the steady beat of my husband's heart. "It is not about giving him a chance, Isaiah. It is about understanding the depth of his betrayal. He used the excuse of family duty to justify stealing my identity. I need to know if he is still willing to use that same excuse when he finds out his golden boy son-in-law robbed him blind. I need to see him squirm." I pulled away from Isaiah and picked up my phone. I dialed my father's private cell number, knowing he would answer. He still thought he had the upper hand after our lunch. He still thought I was going to cave to the pressure. When he answered, his voice was curt and demanding, asking if I had come to my senses and decided to sign the power of attorney. I told him I was not calling to sign anything. I told him I needed to see him immediately without Aaliyah and without Preston. I gave him the address of my corporate headquarters and told him if he wanted any chance of saving his clinic, he would be sitting in my lobby in exactly 30 minutes. I hung up the phone before he could argue. The trap was set, and the first mouse was about to walk right in. Exactly 28 minutes later, my assistant buzzed my office phone. She told me a man claiming to be my father was pacing aggressively in the main lobby, demanding to be escorted upstairs. He was allegedly yelling at the receptionist about how important he was. I told her to send him up to my private executive office. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the sprawling city skyline. When the heavy oak doors finally opened, my father walked in. He tried desperately to maintain his usual posture of arrogant authority, but his eyes betrayed his true feelings. He was taking in the imported mahogany furniture, the original artwork on the walls, and the sheer scale of the corporate operation I had built from the ground up. But true to his toxic nature, he completely refused to acknowledge my success. Instead, he focused his energy on trying to regain control of the narrative. He sat down in the leather guest chair across from my desk without being invited. "I assume this little dramatic power play means you are finally ready to listen to reason, Jada," he said, crossing his legs and smoothing out the crease in his trousers. He looked down at his expensive watch with a sigh of annoyance. "I cancelled a very important golf game with the hospital board for this, so let us make it quick. Where are the papers for the power of attorney? Hand them over so we can put this ugly little misunderstanding behind us." I walked over to my desk and sat down slowly, keeping my hands folded calmly on the polished wood. "I told you on the phone I am not signing anything, Dad. I brought you here to talk about the $200,000 loan you took out in my name 5 years ago. I want to know exactly why you did it." He sighed dramatically, rolling his eyes toward the ceiling like he was dealing with a stubborn toddler throwing a tantrum. "We already went over this exhaustively at lunch, Jada. The medical clinic was experiencing a temporary cash flow issue. I needed liquid capital immediately, and your credit history was sitting there completely available. I raised you from birth. I paid for your expensive private school education. I put food in your mouth and a roof over your head for 18 years. Using your social security number was the absolute least you could do to repay the massive financial burden you placed on this family. You are my daughter, and your assets belong to this family. You should be thanking me for managing your credit so well for the past 5 years." instead of acting like some kind of spoiled victim. It was textbook psychological manipulation. It was the ultimate gaslighting. He sat there in my office in the building I owned, trying to convince me that committing federal identity theft against his own child was a noble act of financial management. I let him finish his arrogant little speech before I leaned forward. If it was just about saving the medical clinic, Dad, I might have almost understood it, I said quietly, keeping my voice perfectly steady. A desperate man facing the collapse of his business does desperate things. But we both know the clinic never saw a single dime of that money, do we? His jaw tightened instantly, and the smug, confident look on his face faltered for a fraction of a second. I do not know what you are talking about, he snapped, his voice pitching up slightly. I managed the business funds appropriately. I shook my head slowly. No, you did not. You handed the money directly over to Preston. And Preston dumped the entire $200,000 into his failing hedge fund to cover a massive margin call. He embezzled the money, Dad? He stole it to cover his own disastrous financial failures, and he used you to do it. I watched his face closely, waiting for the shock, waiting for the outrage. I waited for my father to explode in anger, realizing that his golden boy son-in-law had played him for an absolute fool. But the shock never came. My father just looked away, staring hard at the corner of my desk. His silence was heavier and more devastating than any verbal confession could have been. A cold, terrifying realization washed over my entire body. You knew, I whispered the words, feeling like sharp glass in my throat. You knew he stole the money all along. My father slammed his hand hard on the leather armrest of his chair. He did not steal it. He barked, his face turning a deep shade of crimson. It was a strategic bridge loan. Preston is a very important man in this city, Jada. He manages investment portfolios for some of the wealthiest and most influential families at the country club. He made one bad real estate investment, and he needed capital to quietly cover the loss, so his investors would not panic and pull their funding. If his firm went under, the scandal would have completely ruined our family name. Aaliyah would have been humiliated in front of her peers. I had to protect them. I sat back in my chair, completely stunned by the sheer magnitude of his betrayal. You committed federal wire fraud to protect his country club image? I asked, my voice trembling with a mixture of raw rage and profound disgust. You sacrificed my name, my credit, and my entire future so your white son-in-law could keep playing a rich hedge fund manager. He leaned across the desk, pointing a trembling finger right at my face. You did not have a future, Jada. You were an 18-year-old girl who threw her life away to play house with a dirty blue-collar worker. You were living in a freezing slum. Your credit score was completely useless to you anyway. Preston is a pillar of this community. He provides for your sister. He elevates our family status in society. Sacrificing your unused credit to save his firm was a necessary business decision. You owe us your absolute silence as payment for the endless shame you brought upon us when you got pregnant. The room went completely still. There it was, laid bare for me to see. The ugly, undeniable truth of my family. My father hated my husband for working honestly with his hands, but he was perfectly willing to break federal law and destroy his own daughter's life to protect a white-collar criminal simply because Preston wore a tailored suit and played golf. It was not just about money anymore. It was about deep-seated classism. It was about his pathetic need to be accepted by a society that only valued the illusion of wealth. Any lingering shred of hope I had for my father died in that exact moment. The little girl who just wanted her dad to be proud of her was finally gone forever. In her place was a corporate executive who was ready to go to absolute war. I picked up my office phone and pressed a button on the intercom. Please have security come to my office to escort my guest out of the building, I said calmly into the speaker. My father stood up, his face twisted in ugly anger. You cannot kick me out, Jada. We are not done here. You are going to keep your mouth shut about this, or I swear to heaven I will destroy you. I looked up at him, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, sharp resolve. You cannot destroy something you already threw away, Dad. I gave you a chance to prove you were a victim of Preston and his manipulation. Instead, you proved you were his willing accomplice. Tell Preston to get his affairs in order, and tell Aaliyah she might want to start looking for a very good bankruptcy lawyer. Because by tomorrow morning, I am burning your entire fake empire to the ground. Two large security guards walked into the office and my father backed away from my desk. He pointed a shaking finger at me, cursing my name, as the guards escorted him out into the hallway. He was panicking, and a panicked man always runs back to his accomplices. I knew exactly what he was going to do next. He was going to call my mother and my sister and tell them I was going to the federal authorities. They were going to feel threatened. And toxic people who feel threatened always strike back with the most vicious, dirty tactics they can find. I just did not realize how low they were actually willing to go. The weekend arrived, bringing a warm breeze and bright, clear skies to the city. We decided to host a large barbecue for Isaiah's extended family in our sprawling backyard. The air smelled beautifully of hickory smoke and grilled ribs. Isaiah's brothers were playing a loud game of basketball with Malik on the driveway court. His mother was sitting on the shaded patio, sipping sweet peach tea and laughing at a story someone was telling. It was a perfect picture of genuine family love and unwavering support. It was the exact kind of unconditional love my own parents had always lacked, and the kind of environment my sister Aaliyah could never understand. I was standing at the outdoor kitchen island, tossing a large salad when the intercom at our front security gate buzzed loudly. I wiped my hands on a fresh towel and walked over to the digital monitor, expecting to see the local catering company delivering the extra bags of ice we had ordered for the coolers. Instead, the screen showed a plain white government sedan parked at the gate. Two people, a man and a woman in cheap gray business suits, were standing out front holding thick clipboards. I pressed the intercom button and asked how I could help them. They aggressively identified themselves as lead investigators from the State Department of Child Protective Services. They said they had an emergency field warrant to immediately check on the physical welfare of a minor named Malik, residing at this address. The absolute chill that ran down my spine was paralyzing. I pressed the button to open the heavy iron gate and walked slowly back out to the patio. I caught Isaiah's eye across the yard and gave him a sharp look that immediately told him something was terribly wrong. He put down the grill tongs, wiped his hands on his apron, and walked quickly over to me. When the two agents walked around the side of the house, the entire barbecue went completely dead silent. The soulful music kept playing from the outdoor speakers, but nobody was laughing anymore. The male investigator stepped forward, flashing a badge on a lanyard, and asked to speak with Jada and Isaiah privately inside the house. We led them into our formal living room away from our worried guests. The female agent did not even bother looking at the expensive custom artwork or the immaculate cleanliness of our home. She just opened her folder and started reading mechanically from a printed intake report. She said they had received an anonymous emergency tip late yesterday evening. The caller claimed that our teenage son Malik was living in a deeply toxic and physically abusive environment. The report stated that he was being forced to work long, grueling hours doing dangerous manual plumbing labor instead of attending his school classes. It claimed he was subjected to violent, unpredictable outbursts from a financially unstable father. The anonymous caller even alleged that we were keeping him locked in a house filled with hazardous industrial chemicals and that he was severely malnourished. I stood there listening to the absolute garbage spilling from her mouth, and I knew exactly who had made that vile call. My mother Brenda and my sister Aaliyah. They had taken my father's panicked phone call from yesterday and spun it into the most vicious weapon they could possibly find. They knew exactly how incredibly dangerous it was to send state agents to the home of a successful black family. They knew the historical trauma and the sheer physical risk involved in weaponizing the authorities against us. But they absolutely did not care. They wanted to terrorize me. They wanted to show me that if I threatened their precious country club lifestyle and exposed Preston's corporate fraud, they would try to take my only child away. This was the ultimate depraved betrayal. My mother had completely ignored her grandson for 15 years. She had called him a terrible mistake when I was pregnant. She had refused to even look at him when she stood in my foyer demanding $50,000 just days ago. And now she was using his safety as a fabricated weapon to protect her white son-in-law from going to federal prison. Isaiah crossed his arms, his thick muscles tight under his dark shirt. I saw the thick veins in his neck bulge. He had spent his entire adult life working tirelessly to prove he was a devoted father and an excellent provider. He had built a massive corporate empire so his son would never, ever have to struggle the way we did in that freezing apartment. And now these two strangers were standing in his living room accusing him of being an abusive monster. His voice was dangerously low and steady when he finally spoke. "You are standing in a custom-built multi-million-dollar estate," he said, staring directly into the male agent's eyes. "My son attends an elite private academy, where he is currently on the high honor roll. He has a college trust fund larger than your entire departmental retirement account. Does this look like a financially unstable blue-collar slum to you?" The male agent shifted uncomfortably, looking nervously around the massive sunlit living room. "We have to follow up on every mandatory call, regardless of the apparent socioeconomic status of the neighborhood," he said mechanically. The anonymous caller was very specific and very persistent. They said the outward appearance of extreme wealth was just a fake front, and that the child was in immediate physical danger behind closed doors. "We need to thoroughly inspect the premises, and we need to interview Malik completely alone." I felt a fierce maternal rage rising violently in my chest, so hot, it threatened to choke me. They wanted to aggressively interrogate my 15-year-old son on a beautiful Saturday afternoon while he was just trying to play basketball with his family. They wanted to drag an innocent boy into this dirty psychological family war. I looked at the agents and nodded my head slowly. "You can inspect whatever you want," I said, my voice cold and hard like forged steel. "But you are going to find exactly nothing here. And when this ridiculous charade is over, I am going to have my corporate legal team file a massive civil lawsuit against your department for targeted harassment. Then I am going to file another devastating lawsuit against the specific person who made this false police report." I turned around, walked back out to the sunny patio, and called Malik over to the glass doors. He jogged up to me, spinning the basketball on his long fingers, sweating and smiling happily. I took the ball from him and put my hands gently on his broad shoulders. I told him quietly that some people from the state government were inside, and they needed to ask him some incredibly silly questions about our family. I told him not to be afraid of them and to just tell the absolute truth. Malik is not just a smart kid. He is incredibly perceptive, and he knew exactly who my family was. He looked through the glass doors at the two rigid agents, and his bright smile vanished instantly. "Did she call them?" he asked, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Did Grandmother Brenda do this to us?" I squeezed his shoulders tightly. "Yes, baby. She did," I replied honestly, not shielding him from the ugly reality. "Because she is terrified of us, and she wants to scare us into backing down. But we do not get scared in this house. We fight back with the absolute truth." Malik nodded, his jaw setting into a hard, stubborn line that looked exactly like his father. He wiped the sweat from his forehead and walked bravely through the glass doors into the living room. Isaiah and I stood quietly in the kitchen, watching closely through the open archway as the agent sat down with our son. My family actually thought this dirty tactic would break my spirit. They thought bringing the authorities into my home would humiliate me and force me to drop the federal wire fraud charges. They thought I would trade my silence for my son's safety, but they had completely forgotten who raised Malik. He was not a helpless pawn to be moved around their board, and he was about to end their pathetic little game before it even fully began. Malik sat down on the edge of the large leather sofa, facing the two state investigators. The female agent leaned forward, adopting a soft, patronizing voice that people use when speaking to a frightened child. She asked him if he felt safe in this house and if his parents ever made him do things that physically hurt him. Malik did not fidget or look away. He sat with his shoulders perfectly square and looked her right in the eye. He told her he felt incredibly safe, and that the only thing his parents forced him to do was maintain his straight average at his private academy. The male agent cleared his throat and looked at his clipboard. He asked Malik about the plumbing work and the alleged exposure to hazardous industrial chemicals. Malik actually let out a small, genuine laugh. He explained that his father owned a massive commercial services corporation, and that any time he spent at the warehouse was strictly educational, because he planned to take over the family empire one day. He told them he was learning logistics and corporate management, not scrubbing toxic waste from concrete floors. The two agents exchanged a brief, uncertain look. The narrative they had been fed by the anonymous caller was falling apart completely in the face of this articulate, well-dressed teenager. The female agent tried one last time pressing him about the claims of a financially unstable and violent household. She asked if anyone in the family had a temper or if he was ever threatened. Malik nodded slowly, his expression turning deadly serious. He said he was absolutely being threatened, but not by his parents. He reached into the pocket of his tailored shorts and pulled out his smartphone. He looked at the agents and calmly explained that his grandmother had been calling his private cell phone for the past 24 hours, leaving increasingly unhinged voicemails, because his mother had refused to give her a massive sum of money. I watched from the kitchen as Malik tapped the screen of his phone and turned the volume all the way up. He set the device on the glass coffee table right between the two agents. The crisp, clear audio of my mother Brenda filled the quiet living room. Her voice was shrill and vibrating with toxic rage. "You tell your ungrateful mother that she is going to sign those papers, Malik," her recorded voice spat out of the speaker. "You tell her that if she does not wire that $50,000 to your grandfather by Monday morning, I am going to make sure you are taken out of that house. I know people at the State Department. I will call them and tell them you are living in a filthy, abusive home. I will have you thrown into the foster care system so fast your head will spin. You and your worthless father are going to lose everything if your mother does not pay what she owes this family." The voicemail ended with a sharp click, leaving a heavy, stunning silence in its wake. The two agents sat frozen on the sofa, staring at the phone on the coffee table as if it were a live grenade. The color had completely drained from the female agent's face. They had just listened to undeniable audio proof of criminal extortion and malicious child welfare fraud. Isaiah and I walked slowly into the living room, standing right behind our son. I rested my hands on Malik's shoulders, feeling an overwhelming surge of pride. He had not panicked. He had just systematically destroyed my family's entire vicious scheme with a single tap of his finger. I looked at the two investigators. I asked them if they needed to hear the other 3 voicemails my mother had left, or if that one was sufficient to clear up their concerns about my son's welfare. The male agent immediately closed his thick folder and snapped his clipboard shut. He looked deeply embarrassed and incredibly apologetic. He cleared his throat and said that would not be necessary. He told us that the case was officially closed effectively immediately and that the allegations were entirely unfounded. The female agent stood up and offered a sincere apology. She said they were required by law to investigate every claim, but it was abundantly clear that their department had been weaponized in a private financial dispute. She looked at Malik and told him he was an incredibly brave and smart young man for documenting the threats. I stepped forward, blocking their path to the door. I told them that an apology was nice, but it was not enough. I reminded them that filing a false child abuse report was a severe crime. I demanded that they officially flag the anonymous caller in their system and forward the audio evidence to the local police department for harassment and extortion. I gave them my mother's full legal name, Brenda, and her exact home address. The male agent pulled a business card from his pocket and handed it to Isaiah. He promised that the department took false reporting very seriously because it wasted valuable resources meant to protect children who were actually in danger. He assured us that he would personally file the paperwork to have Brenda investigated for filing a malicious false report, and that a detective would be reaching out to us to collect the audio files. We escorted them out the front door and watched their white government sedan drive away. They had arrived expecting to find a terrified child in a broken home, and they left with a criminal case against the wealthy country club woman who had sent them. When the gate finally closed behind them, the heavy tension in the air completely evaporated. Isaiah let out a deep breath and pulled Malik into a massive bear hug. He told our son how incredibly proud he was of him for standing his ground and protecting our family. I joined the hug, feeling the solid warmth of the two most important people in my life. My mother and Aaliyah had fired their most dangerous weapon at us, and it had blown up right in their faces. They had tried to use the state to terrorize me into submission, but instead, they had just handed me another piece of devastating ammunition. Now Brenda was not just facing the financial ruin of her husband's clinic, she was facing criminal harassment charges and the very real threat of being publicly arrested in front of her precious country club friends. We walked back out to the patio where the music was still playing and our family was waiting. The barbecue resumed with even more joy and laughter than before. We had faced the worst my toxic family could throw at us, and we had emerged completely victorious. But the weekend was not over yet. Tomorrow was Monday. Tomorrow was the deadline for the $50,000 payment. And while my mother was about to deal with the police, my arrogant brother-in-law Preston was about to face a nightmare of his own making. The dominoes were lined up perfectly, and I was entirely ready to push the first one over. Monday morning arrived with a heavy gray sky that perfectly matched the atmosphere inside Preston's downtown corporate office. Preston stood behind his massive glass desk, staring blankly at the multiple computer monitors displaying his firm's internal financial health. Every single chart was a steep, downward red line. He was sweating through his custom silk shirt. His hedge fund was completely hollowed out. The $200,000 he had stolen using my name had only bought him a few months of fake stability before the market shifted again. He was currently moving phantom money around just to pay his own administrative staff. He had spent the entire weekend ignoring my father's panicked phone calls because he knew the clinic was going under, and he did not have a single dollar left to bail them out. His sleek office phone buzzed loudly, breaking the tense silence. His assistant told him that Richard Harrison, the lead partner of the largest real estate development firm in the state, was waiting in the conference room. Preston's stomach violently dropped. Richard Harrison was the anchor investor for a $50 million commercial high-rise project that Preston was currently managing. It was the only legitimate deal keeping his hedge fund from being audited by the federal oversight committees. If Harrison pulled his capital, Preston would be personally bankrupt by Friday, and the forensic auditors would find the empty shell accounts within hours. Preston grabbed his suit jacket and put on his best fake smile. He walked into the conference room radiating a false sense of absolute confidence. Richard Harrison did not stand up to greet him. Harrison was a ruthless businessman who did not care about country club memberships or expensive golf games. He cared about numbers, and right now his numbers were in jeopardy. Harrison tossed a thick legal binder onto the polished table right in front of Preston. Harrison did not waste time with small talk. He looked Preston directly in the eye and told him the entire high-rise project was frozen. He explained that the city council had just passed a mandatory green energy compliance code for all new commercial developments. The primary investor board was demanding strict adherence to the new environmental, social, and governance standards. Harrison said the mechanical and plumbing contractor Preston had originally hired for the build had just failed their corporate audit and lost their certification. Preston tried to wave his hand dismissively, using his smooth talking charm to minimize the problem. He promised Harrison that he would make a few phone calls and find a replacement contractor by the end of the month. Harrison slammed his hand flat on the table, echoing sharply through the large room. He told Preston he did not have a month. He told him he had exactly 48 hours. The investor board was threatening to pull the entire $50 million funding package by Wednesday morning if they did not have a signed contract with an approved vendor. Harrison leaned forward and told Preston they specifically needed an HVAC and commercial plumbing firm with a verified ESGA rating. It was the highest possible compliance rating in the state. Harrison made it completely clear that this was Preston's ultimate test. If Preston could not secure the contractor, the deal was dead. And if the deal died, Harrison promised he would personally trigger a full financial audit of Preston's hedge fund to recover his initial investments. Preston felt the blood drain completely from his face. An audit was a death sentence. An audit would immediately expose the missing millions and the wire fraud he had committed using my identity. He would not just lose his luxury cars and his mansion, he would go to federal prison for a very long time. He promised Harrison he would have the contract signed and delivered by Tuesday afternoon. Harrison stood up, straightened his tie, and told Preston he better not fail before walking out of the office without shaking hands. When the glass door closed, Preston completely lost his mind. He swept his arm across the side table, sending an expensive crystal decanter crashing into the wall. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving with absolute panic. He ran back into his private office and screamed at his assistant to get the state commercial directory on his computer screen immediately. He spent the next 3 hours frantically calling every major mechanical contractor in the region. One by one, they all turned him down. Some did not have the manpower for a $50 million high-rise. Others were booked out for the next 2 years. But the biggest hurdle was the compliance rating. Almost nobody in the state had managed to secure the elite ESGA rating because the corporate requirements were incredibly strict and required millions of dollars in sustainable infrastructure. Preston's desperation grew into blind terror. He was staring at the walls of a prison cell closing in on him. He yelled at his staff, threatening to fire everyone if they did not find him a company that met the criteria. Finally, his senior project manager ran into the office holding a printed profile. The manager told Preston they found exactly one commercial services corporation in the entire state that had the capacity, the availability, and the active ESGA rating required to save the deal. Preston snatched the paper from the manager's hands. He did not bother to look at the executive board names or the history of the firm. He only saw the bold logo at the top of the page. Apex Commercial Services. He saw their massive portfolio of successful government contracts and their flawless environmental compliance scores. A wave of arrogant relief washed over Preston's panicked mind. He convinced himself that he was saved. He thought he was dealing with some faceless group of blue-collar workers who had just gotten lucky with a state certification. In his elitist mind, contractors were just uneducated laborers who could be easily bullied and manipulated by a smart hedge fund manager with a shiny briefcase. He told his legal team to immediately draft a predatory vendor agreement. He planned to walk into their headquarters, flash the $50 million project budget, and force them to sign a binding contract that heavily favored his firm. Preston fixed his tie in the reflection of his window. He grabbed his Italian leather briefcase, completely unaware that the very company he was about to try and bully was entirely owned by the woman he had tried to destroy. He was walking directly into the trap I had set, and he was doing it with a smile on his face. He told his assistant to cancel his afternoon meetings because he was going to go save the company. He marched to the elevator, feeling like the smartest man in the world, absolutely clueless that he was about to meet the architect of his total destruction. Preston drove across the city in his leased luxury car, feeling a surge of adrenaline that always accompanied a major business deal. He turned the radio up, trying to drown out the lingering anxiety about the federal audit threat. In his mind, he was already rehearsing the aggressive negotiation tactics he would use on the management team at Apex Commercial Services. He figured they were just a bunch of guys in hard hats who had stumbled into a lucky state certification. He planned to walk in, flash the $50 million project budget, and offer them a predatory contract that would trap them into doing the work for a fraction of their usual rate. He was entirely convinced that his expensive suit and his smooth Wall Street vocabulary would easily overwhelm a group of blue-collar workers. He did not even bother to look up the name of the chief executive officer on their corporate website. He assumed it was just some rough, uneducated contractor who would be easily blinded by the prospect of working with a prestigious hedge fund manager. He pulled up to the address his assistant had provided, expecting to find a dusty industrial park or a cheap warehouse district. Instead, his navigation system directed him to a sleek, towering glass skyscraper right in the middle of the downtown financial district. Preston frowned as he parked his car in the pristine underground garage. He walked into the main lobby looking up at the vaulted ceilings and the imported marble floors. It was significantly nicer than his own crumbling office building. But his deep-seated arrogance quickly overrode his brief moment of surprise. He rationalized that the company must just be renting a small suite on one of the lower floors to put on a good face for corporate clients. He straightened his silk tie, grabbed his leather briefcase, and marched confidently toward the primary reception desk. The main lobby was buzzing with quiet professional activity. There were several people waiting in line to speak with the front desk staff, but Preston did not care. He completely ignored the queue, walking straight past a group of visiting contractors, and planted himself directly in front of the head receptionist. She was a young professional woman who looked up from her computer screen with a polite but firm expression. "Excuse me, sir," the receptionist said calmly, keeping her voice even. "There is a line. You will need to wait your turn." Preston scoffed, leaning his elbows aggressively on the polished granite counter. He reached into his pocket and threw his thick, embossed business card onto the desk like it was a winning lottery ticket. "I do not wait in lines." He snapped his voice loud enough to make several people in the lobby turn and look. "My name is Preston, and I am the managing director of a premier private equity firm. I am here to offer your little plumbing company the contract of a lifetime. I need to see your chief executive officer right now." The receptionist did not even glance at the expensive business card resting on the counter. She maintained her absolute professionalism, perfectly trained to handle entitled men who thought they owned the world. "Do you have a scheduled appointment with the executive office?" she asked, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. "Our chief executive officer does not take unannounced walk-in meetings regardless of the company you represent." Preston let out a harsh, mocking laugh. He looked around the lobby, shaking his head as if he were dealing with an incompetent child. "You do not understand how the real business world works, do you, sweetheart?" he said, his tone dripping with heavy condescension. "I am holding the keys to a $50 million high-rise development project. I am the anchor investor. I do not need an appointment to hand your boss the biggest paycheck he has ever seen in his entire miserable life. Now pick up your phone call upstairs and tell whoever is in charge that their lucky day has finally arrived." The receptionist simply pushed the business card back toward him. "I am sorry, sir, but I cannot allow you past the security turnstiles without clearance from the executive floor. If you would like to leave your contact information, I can have a project manager reach out to you later this week to schedule an initial consultation." Preston's face flushed a dark, angry red. The panic he had been suppressing all morning suddenly flared up again. He did not have until later this week. He had less than 48 hours before Richard Harrison pulled the funding and triggered the federal audit that would send him to prison. He slammed his hand hard against the granite counter, making the receptionist jump slightly. "Listen to me, you glorified secretary," Preston hissed, leaning over the desk with a vicious glare. "I am not leaving my information, and I am not talking to some mid-level project manager. I am offering you a compliance contract that your people desperately need to stay relevant. If you do not let me up those elevators right now, I will walk out that door and make sure your company is completely blacklisted from every major commercial development in this state. I will have your job by the end of the day." Before the receptionist could call the building security, a tall man in a tailored dark suit stepped out from the private executive elevator bank. It was Jonathan, our lead corporate attorney. He walked calmly over to the reception desk, observing Preston's red-faced tantrum with cold, analytical eyes. Jonathan told the receptionist that it was fine and that the executive office had actually been anticipating this specific arrival. Preston immediately puffed out his chest, adjusting his suit jacket. He looked at the receptionist with a smug, victorious sneer. "That is exactly what I thought," he muttered, snatching his business card off the counter. "It is nice to see someone in this building actually understands how to recognize a superior business opportunity." Jonathan did not offer to shake Preston's hand. He simply gestured toward the private elevators. "Follow me, Preston," he said, his voice entirely devoid of any warmth or respect. "The chief executive officer will see you now." Preston followed Jonathan into the wood-paneled elevator, feeling an overwhelming sense of absolute triumph. He honestly believed his aggressive bullying had worked perfectly. He thought he had successfully intimidated the staff and bypassed all the normal corporate protocols simply because of his sheer importance. He thought about how his wife Aaliyah would praise him tonight when he told her he had single-handedly saved the hedge fund. He imagined the look of total respect on Richard Harrison's face when he slapped the signed contract on the table tomorrow morning. The elevator chimed softly as it reached the top floor, the heavy doors sliding open to reveal a massive glass-walled executive suite. Preston gripped his leather briefcase tightly, stepping out onto the plush carpet entirely clueless that he was not ascending to a victory. He was riding the elevator straight to his own professional execution, ready to walk into that boardroom and crush whatever simple blue-collar worker was sitting in the big chair. The heavy elevator doors slid shut with a soft chime, leaving Preston standing alone in the massive executive reception area. He walked across the thick plush carpet, taking in the sheer scale of the top-floor suite. The walls were lined with custom mahogany panels and expensive modern art. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass partitions, he could see the main boardroom overlooking the entire downtown skyline. It was a corner office designed for absolute power, and Preston felt a familiar thrill of greed wash over him. He gripped the handle of his leather briefcase, tightly adjusting his silk tie one last time. He walked confidently through the open double doors of the primary office, ready to dominate whoever was sitting behind the desk. The office was bathed in natural sunlight, but the chief executive officer was not looking at the door. A massive, high-backed leather chair was turned completely around, facing the panoramic window. Preston did not wait for an invitation to speak. He marched right up to the front of the enormous polished desk and unlatched his briefcase. "Good afternoon," Preston said, projecting his voice with that fake country club authority he loved to use. "My name is Preston, and I manage one of the most prestigious private equity funds in the city. I know your receptionist probably tried to keep me downstairs, but I am not a man who waits for appointments. I am currently the anchor investor for a $50 million commercial high-rise project. We had a slight compliance issue with our previous contractor, and it has come to my attention that your firm holds the specific compliance rating my board requires. I am here to offer you the exclusive mechanical and plumbing contract for the entire build." Preston pulled a thick stack of legal documents from his briefcase and tossed them onto the desk with a heavy thud. He leaned forward, resting his knuckles on the wood, smiling at the back of the leather chair. "Now I know a project of this magnitude is probably overwhelming for a local commercial crew." Preston continued, his tone dripping with condescending arrogance. "But do not worry. My legal team has drafted an agreement that takes care of all the complex financial structuring. All you have to do is sign on the dotted line, and I will personally ensure your little company gets the biggest payout it has ever seen." The room remained completely silent for a long, agonizing moment. The only sound was the faint hum of the central air conditioning. Then the high-backed leather chair slowly began to turn. Preston stood there, holding his arrogant smile, expecting to see a rough, weathered contractor staring back at him in absolute awe. Instead, his entire world violently stopped spinning. Isaiah was sitting in the chair. He was not wearing dirty coveralls or heavy work boots. He was wearing a dark bespoke suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. A crisp white shirt and a solid silk tie completed the look of a man who commanded a multi-million-dollar corporate empire. He sat completely relaxed, resting his large, strong hands on the polished surface of the desk. Isaiah looked at the thick stack of contracts Preston had just thrown down, and then he looked up, meeting Preston's panicked gaze. He did not yell. He did not look angry. He just smiled. It was the same cold, chilling smile he had given my mother in our foyer. "How is the plumbing business?" "Anyway," Isaiah asked, his voice deep and perfectly calm, echoing the exact insult Preston had thrown at him during the country club lunch. Did I manage to wash the grease off my hands before I touched this nice furniture? Preston's face lost all of its color, instantly turning a sickening shade of pale gray. His jaw went completely slack. His pale blue eyes darted frantically around the massive executive office, searching for an explanation that his arrogant brain could process. He looked at the framed corporate awards on the wall and the expensive nameplate on the desk that clearly read, Isaiah Chief Executive Officer. "What are you doing here?" Preston stammered, his voice cracking pathetically. His smooth, confident facade was completely shattering into pieces. "This is a joke. You are a plumber. You fix toilets. You do not run a corporate holding firm." "I built this corporate holding firm," Preston Isaiah replied, leaning back in his chair. "I built it from the ground up while you were busy playing golf and pretending to be a financial genius. Apex Commercial Services is my company. I own the warehouses, I own the fleet of trucks, and I own the exclusive compliance rating that you desperately need to save your miserable life." Preston stumbled backward away from the desk, as if he had just been physically burned. His mind was short-circuiting. The reality of the situation was crashing down on him with the force of a freight train. The man he had openly mocked, the black man he had degraded and treated like uneducated trash, was sitting on the throne of an empire. And worse than that, Preston realized he was completely trapped. He had less than 48 hours to secure this exact contract, or his investors would trigger the federal audit. The audit that would expose his wire fraud and send him to prison. Isaiah watched the panic spread across Preston's face. He watched the arrogant hedge fund manager realize that his entire future rested in the calloused hands of the man he despised. "You look a little pale," Preston Isaiah noted casually, picking up a heavy silver pen and rolling it between his fingers. "When you sat at that table yesterday and bragged about managing real capital, I assumed you actually had some. But then my accounting team ran a deep background check on your firm. We saw the empty accounts. We saw the desperate shell game you are playing. And we saw exactly where you got the $200,000 to cover your last margin call." Preston's knees actually buckled slightly. He grabbed the back of the guest chair to keep himself from collapsing onto the floor. "You know," he whispered, his voice trembling with absolute terror. "We know everything," Isaiah said, the warmth leaving his voice completely replaced by a freezing absolute authority. "We know about the forged loan. We know about the stolen identity. We know you are facing a massive federal audit if you do not walk out of this room with my signature on that paper." Preston looked at the contract sitting on the desk. It was his only lifeline. His arrogant pride fought a violent losing battle against his basic instinct to survive. He swallowed hard, the sound loud in the quiet room. Tears of sheer humiliation began to well up in his eyes. The man who thought he was a titan of industry was suddenly reduced to a begging child. "Please." Preston choked out the word, tasting like poison in his mouth. "Please, Isaiah. You have to sign it. If I do not get this contract, my investors will pull everything. I will lose my firm. I will go to jail. I am begging you." Isaiah stopped rolling the pen. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk, staring directly through Preston's pathetic, breaking soul. "You are begging a lowly plumber to save you?" Isaiah asked softly, forcing Preston to hear his own disgusting words. "Yes," Preston sobbed completely, broken, dropping his head in total defeat. "Yes, I am begging you. Please save me." Isaiah let the heavy silence hang in the air, letting the ultimate humiliation soak deep into Preston's bones. Then he reached over and pressed a button on his intercom. "You can come in now, Jada," Isaiah said into the speaker. "I believe our guest is finally ready to negotiate." The side door of the executive suite clicked open. I stepped out from the adjoining private conference room where I had been listening to every single pathetic word. I walked slowly across the plush carpet, my heels sinking slightly into the expensive fabric. Preston turned his head, his eyes widening in absolute horror as he saw me. He had spent his entire adult life looking down on me, treating me like an uneducated girl who was beneath his social class. Now he was on his knees, metaphorically speaking, in my building, begging my husband for his very survival. I walked around the massive polished desk and stood right beside Isaiah. I rested my hand gently on his shoulder, feeling the solid strength of the man who had built this empire with me. I looked down at Preston, watching the arrogant hedge fund manager physically shrink in his chair. He looked like a cornered animal, his expensive silk tie suddenly looking like a hangman's noose. "Hello, Preston," I said, my voice calm and completely devoid of any sympathy. "You look a little different than you did at the country club on Sunday. I suppose it is a lot harder to make cheap jokes about blue-collar workers when you are sitting in their corporate headquarters begging them to save you from federal prison." Preston opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His brain was completely overloaded. He looked back and forth between Isaiah and me, the reality of his monumental miscalculation finally crushing whatever was left of his massive ego. He realized that we were not just a random company his project manager had found. We were the absolute apex predators in this scenario, and he had walked willingly straight into our jaws. "Jada," he finally whispered, his voice trembling so badly he could barely form the syllables. "You set this up. You knew Harrison needed a compliance rating. You knew I would have to come here." "I did not set up your failing investments, Preston," I replied smoothly. "I did not force you to embezzle $200,000 from a fraudulent loan. And I certainly did not force you to march into my lobby today and throw a temper tantrum like a spoiled child. You dug this grave entirely by yourself. I just bought the cemetery." Isaiah leaned forward, picking up the predatory contract Preston had thrown on the desk. He casually flipped through the pages, shaking his head at the ridiculous terms. "You actually thought you could walk in here and force us to take a 30% pay cut," Isaiah said, tossing the papers into the recycling bin beside his desk. "You really are delusional. But lucky for you, my wife is a very generous woman. She has decided to offer you a counter-proposal." I pressed the intercom button and asked Jonathan, our lead corporate attorney, to bring in the final paperwork. The heavy office doors opened and Jonathan walked in carrying a single crisp document inside a blue legal folder. He set it on the desk right in front of Preston and handed him a heavy silver pen. Preston looked at the document, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He read the bold heading at the top of the page. It was not a commercial real estate contract. It was a sworn legal affidavit addressed directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission. "What is this?" Preston gasped, his eyes darting frantically up to my face. "That is your only way out," I explained, my voice turning cold and hard as steel. "It is a full written confession. It details exactly how you used my stolen Social Security number to secure the fraudulent loan. It details how you embezzled those funds to cover your margin calls. It includes all the bank routing numbers, the fake shell companies, and the forged signatures." Preston pushed the folder away, his face turning completely white. "I cannot sign this," he panicked, his voice rising to a hysterical pitch. "If I sign this, I am admitting to federal wire fraud. I will be disbarred from trading. I will go to prison. You are asking me to sign my own death warrant." I leaned over the desk, placing my hands flat on the polished wood, bringing my face incredibly close to his. "You are already dead, Preston," I whispered fiercely. "If you do not sign that confession right now, I will pick up this phone and call Richard Harrison. I will tell him exactly why his anchor investor is really panicking. He will pull his $50 million before lunchtime. Your investors will trigger a hostile audit by tomorrow morning. When the authorities find out you hid this from them, they will bury you under the jail for maximum sentencing." I stood back up, smoothing my tailored suit jacket. "But if you sign that affidavit right now," I continued, "I will have Jonathan broker a deal with the federal prosecutors. Self-reporting a financial crime significantly reduces the sentencing guidelines. And more importantly, if you sign it, Isaiah will sign the commercial contract for the high-rise project. We will save Harrison's deal. Your investors will not lose their capital. You will still go to prison, Preston, but you will not spend the rest of your life paying off civil restitution to furious billionaires. Preston sat completely paralyzed, staring at the silver pen resting on the blue folder. He was trying desperately to find a loophole, a hidden exit, a way to charm his way out of the trap. But there was absolutely nothing. He was completely outmatched by the people he had spent years treating like garbage. We are family. Preston pleaded, tears actually spilling down his pale cheeks. Please, Jada. Aaliyah is your sister. If I go to prison, she will be completely ruined. You cannot do this to your own blood. I felt a dark, bitter laugh rise in my chest. Do not you dare talk to me about family. I snapped, my voice echoing sharply in the large office. Where was your sense of family when you stole my identity? Where was your family loyalty when you let my father take the blame? Where was your precious family when my mother called Child Protective Services and tried to have my son taken away? Preston physically flinched at the mention of my son. He realized there was no mercy left in this room. We had endured 15 years of their toxic abuse, and we were finally balancing the scales. You have exactly 60 seconds to pick up that pen, Preston Isaiah said, checking his expensive watch. After that, the offer expires and I make the call to Harrison. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the sound of Preston's ragged, panicked breathing. He looked at the window at the sprawling city he thought he ruled. He looked at the contract in the trash can. He looked at the silver pen. He knew it was over. The game was completely lost. With a trembling hand, Preston reached out and picked up the pen. He pulled the blue folder closer to him. A loud, pathetic sob escaped his throat as he pressed the ink to the paper and signed his name at the bottom of the sworn confession. He dated it and pushed it across the desk, completely broken. Jonathan immediately picked up the document, inspecting the signature before sliding it into his leather briefcase. He nodded to me, confirming it was legally binding. Isaiah pulled a fresh copy of the commercial real estate contract from his desk drawer. He signed the approval line with quick, confident strokes and tossed it into Preston's lap. There is your building contract, Isaiah said coldly. Have it on Harrison's desk by 3 o'clock. Preston slowly stood up, clutching the contract to his chest like a shield that could no longer protect him. He looked utterly destroyed, a hollow shell of the arrogant man who had walked into the lobby just an hour ago. He did not say a single word as he turned and walked out of the office, his shoulders slumped in total defeat. I watched the heavy doors close behind him, feeling an incredible surge of absolute victory. We had the confession. Preston was finished. But the war was not entirely over. Preston was just the symptom of the disease. The real root of the toxicity was still sitting in my parents' mansion, completely unaware that their golden boy had just surrendered. I looked at Isaiah, a slow, determined smile spreading across my face. It was time to invite the rest of the family to the office for a final reconciliation meeting. I picked up my phone and dialed my father's number. He answered on the first ring, his voice tight with anticipation. I told him that Isaiah and I had discussed the situation at length, and that we were ready to put an end to all the hostility. I kept my tone perfectly submissive, carefully crafting the illusion of a defeated daughter. I told him we wanted to handle this privately and respectfully as a family. I invited him, my mother, and Aaliyah to come down to our corporate boardroom at 4 o'clock that afternoon to sign a final settlement agreement that would resolve the clinic's debt and clear up the issues with Preston's loan. My father let out a heavy sigh of relief, immediately adopting his usual pompous tone. He told me it was about time I remembered my place and honored my obligations to the people who raised me. He promised they would be there to accept my apology and finalize the paperwork. The trap was officially set. We spent the next 2 hours preparing the boardroom for the most important meeting of our lives. We arranged the plush leather chairs around the massive mahogany table, placing expensive bottled water and leather-bound portfolios at each seat to make it look like a standard corporate signing. But hidden inside the sleek ceiling panels, our integrated presentation system was primed for something entirely different. At exactly 10 minutes to 4, My assistant notified me that my family had arrived in the main lobby. I watched them on the security feed from my tablet. They had clearly coordinated their outfits for a victory lap. My father was wearing his best tailored navy suit, his posture rigid with self-importance. My mother was dressed in a pristine white designer dress, carrying a handbag that probably cost more than some people's cars. Aaliyah looked like she was stepping onto a runway, wearing a vibrant red silk blouse and a smug smile that practically radiated through the screen. They treated my lobby staff with the exact same dismissive arrogance Preston had shown earlier walking past the reception desk, as if they owned the entire building. They truly believed I had caved to their pressure. They thought my mother's pathetic attempt to use child protective services had terrified me into total submission. Jonathan met them at the elevator bank and escorted them up to the top floor. When the heavy boardroom doors opened, they walked in, looking around the massive glass-walled space with poorly concealed jealousy. They took their seats at the far end of the long table. Aaliyah immediately pulled out her phone, checking her makeup in the dark screen, while my mother criticized the temperature of the room. My father sat at the head of the table, adjusting his expensive watch, looking incredibly impatient. Isaiah and I walked into the boardroom side by side. We did not bring any documents with us. We just walked calmly to the opposite end of the table and sat down facing them. The silence in the room was heavy and charged with a toxic energy. My family looked at our empty hands with slight confusion, but their arrogant confidence remained firmly in place. "Well, let us get on with this," my father said, clapping his hands together once. "We have dinner reservations at the club at 6, so we do not have time to sit around and chat. Where is the power of attorney document, Jada? Bring it out so we can sign it and put this ugly little tantrum of yours behind us." My mother leaned forward, resting her manicured hands on the polished wood. "I hope you realize how much unnecessary stress you have caused this family, Jada," she said, her voice dripping with fake disappointment. "Calling the state authorities on you was a last resort, but you left us no choice. You need to understand that we will always do whatever it takes to protect our legacy. Now that you have finally come to your senses, we can move forward. We expect you to wire the $50,000 for the clinic immediately after we sign the papers." Aaliyah let out a soft, mocking laugh. "I told you, Dad," she chimed in, flipping her hair over her shoulder. She was just throwing a fit for attention. She knows she cannot survive without this family backing her up. Preston is probably laughing in his office right now, knowing that her little corporate act completely fell apart the second we pushed back. "So just give us the papers, Jada, so we can go celebrate saving the clinic." I looked at the three of them, sitting there in their expensive clothes, completely blinded by their own towering egos. They were so incredibly eager to strip me of my resources and humiliate me all over again. They had no idea that they were sitting inside a burning building. I did not reach for a pen. I did not pull out any settlement papers. Instead, I reached under the edge of the mahogany table and pressed a small silver button on the control panel. The heavy blackout blinds automatically descended over the panoramic windows, plunging the boardroom into a dim, dramatic shadow. A massive motorized projection screen lowered silently from the ceiling directly behind Isaiah and me. "What is going on?" my father demanded, gripping the armrests of his chair. "We did not come here for a presentation." I ignored him and pressed another button. The high-definition projector clicked on, casting a bright, crisp light across the room. The screen illuminated, revealing a live, secure video conference grid. The faces of 6 different men and women appeared on the screen, sitting in severe government offices and high-end corporate boardrooms. They were not smiling. My family stared at the screen in absolute confusion. Aaliyah squinted, trying to read the titles on the digital nameplates at the bottom of the video feeds. "Allow me to introduce our guests," I said, my voice slicing through the dark room like a razor blade. "On the top left, we have senior investigators from the Federal Securities and Exchange Commission. On the top right, we have 2 special agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation specializing in corporate wire fraud. And occupying the bottom row are the primary anchor investors for Preston's private equity fund, including Richard Harrison." The blood drained from Aaliyah's face so fast she looked like a ghost. She stared at the screen, her mouth opening and closing without any sound coming out. My father half rose from his chair, his eyes darting frantically between me and the federal agents on the wall. "What kind of sick joke is this?" My father barked, his voice cracking with sudden panic. "Turn that off right now, Jada." "It is not a joke, Dad," I replied, leaning back in my chair. "2 hours ago, your brilliant son-in-law sat in the exact seat you are sitting in right now. He was begging for a contract to save his failing hedge fund from a massive federal audit. I agreed to give him the contract, but only if he provided a full sworn written confession detailing exactly how he embezzled $200,000 using my stolen identity." I nodded to Jonathan, who was standing quietly in the corner of the room. He stepped forward and held up the blue legal folder. He opened it and placed a high-resolution scanned copy of Preston's signed affidavit onto the document camera. The undeniable proof of his guilt flashed onto the massive screen for everyone to see. The federal agents on the video feed confirmed they had received the digital transmission of the confession and that warrants were currently being issued for Preston's immediate arrest. Richard Harrison unmuted his microphone and stated coldly that he was liquidating his entire investment portfolio and pursuing maximum civil damages against Preston for severe fiduciary negligence. Aaliyah began to hyperventilate. She gripped the edge of the table, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the wood. "No," she gasped, shaking her head violently. "No, Preston would never do that. He is a genius. He manages millions of dollars. You forged this, Jada. You are trying to frame my husband because you are jealous of our life." "You are welcome to call him," I said, gesturing toward her phone. "But I doubt he will answer. He is probably busy packing a bag before the authorities kick his front door down." My mother let out a horrific wailing sound, clutching her chest. She looked at my father, who was now trembling violently, his arrogant posture completely shattered. "Carlton, do something," she shrieked. "Tell them it was a mistake. Tell them he paid the money back." The lead investigator leaned toward his camera, his voice booming through our surround sound speakers. "Mom, the embezzled funds were never paid back," he stated flatly. "In fact, our preliminary forensic sweep of the accounts initiated an hour ago revealed a secondary layer of fraud. When the initial stolen funds from the identity theft dried up, your son-in-law sought additional capital to cover his massive losses." The investigator paused, looking down at a file on his desk before looking directly at my parents through the lens. "Records show that 6 months ago, Preston executed a second mortgage on a residential property located in Fairfield, Connecticut. He leveraged the full equity of the estate to secure a $500,000 private loan, which he immediately lost in the market." The entire boardroom went completely dead. The Fairfield, Connecticut address was my parents' sprawling colonial mansion. It was the house I grew up in. The house they had kicked me out of. My father collapsed back into his leather chair, his eyes wide with a terror so profound it almost looked like physical agony. "What did you say?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "The house is completely paid off. I own it free and clear." "Not anymore, Dad." I said, the absolute finality of the truth settling over the room. "Preston used his power of attorney access to the family trust to secretly mortgage your house. He took all your equity to pay his own debts, and then he lost every single penny. The bank is going to foreclose on your estate by the end of the month." Aaliyah let out a blood-curdling scream, covering her ears and collapsing forward onto the mahogany table. She sobbed hysterically, the sound of her perfect fake life shattering into a million jagged pieces. My mother simply stared at the blank space in front of her, paralyzed by the realization that she was entirely, utterly broke. The country club memberships, the designer clothes, the pristine reputation, it was all gone, stolen by the very white-collar criminal they had protected while they shamed my blue-collar husband. I looked at the three of them, broken and weeping, in my beautiful boardroom. I felt no pity. I felt no remorse. I felt exactly like the powerful, unstoppable woman I had fought so hard to become. The federal feed cut out, leaving the room in silence, broken only by the sound of their devastating ruin. I stood up from the table looking down at the people who had thrown me away. "I believe this meeting is adjourned," I said softly. "Please see yourselves out. You have a lot of packing to do." The days following that boardroom meeting moved with lightning speed. The federal authorities did not waste a single second. The very next morning, federal agents swarmed Preston's downtown office building. They carried out boxes of hard drives and financial records while Preston was marched out through the front lobby in handcuffs. Local news helicopters captured the entire humiliating scene, broadcasting his absolute downfall to the entire city. Aaliyah had to watch her perfect country club life evaporate on live television. The bank froze all of her personal accounts, leaving her with nothing but the designer clothes in her closet. She tried to move back in with our parents, but she arrived just in time to watch the bank executive serving the final foreclosure notices on the Fairfield estate. Because the second mortgage had been obtained through corporate wire fraud, the bank accelerated the eviction process. My parents were given exactly 48 hours to vacate the massive colonial home they had prized above everything else. They tried to call their wealthy country club friends for help. They called the doctors, the lawyers, the country club president begging for a temporary loan or a place to stay. But in their superficial world, failure was a contagious disease. Nobody answered their calls. Nobody offered them a guest house. Stripped of their stolen wealth and their fake status, my parents were suddenly treated like ghosts by the very society they had worshipped. It was raining heavily on Thursday night when the intercom at my front gate buzzed. Isaiah and I were sitting in the living room reviewing some new contracts. I walked over to the security monitor and looked at the screen. Standing outside in the freezing rain were my mother and my father. They did not have their luxury cars anymore. They had taken a cheap taxi to the edge of our estate. Piled around their feet were dozens of black plastic trash bags, stuffed with whatever clothes and personal items they could grab before the bank locked the doors. It was the exact same way they had thrown my belongings out into the snow 15 years ago. My mother was shivering violently, her makeup running down her face in dark, muddy streaks. My father looked completely broken, his shoulders hunched, his arrogant pride entirely erased by the harsh reality of homelessness. I pressed the intercom button asking what they wanted. My mother's voice cracked through the speaker, sobbing hysterically. She begged me to open the gate. She said they had nowhere else to go. She said Aaliyah was staying in a cheap motel and they could not afford to join her. My father leaned toward the microphone, his voice shaking with absolute defeat. He apologized for everything. He said he was a fool and that he would do anything if I just let them sleep in the garage. They were completely stripped of their ego, standing in the rain, begging the daughter they had discarded for a tiny shred of mercy. I told Isaiah I would be right back. I grabbed an umbrella and walked down the long private driveway toward the heavy iron gates. The rain hit the pavement in heavy sheets, but I felt completely warm inside. I stood on my side of the gate, looking through the metal bars at the two people who had caused me so much pain. My mother reached her hands through the bars, crying and pleading with me to open the lock. I did not press the button to open the gate. I stood there looking at them, realizing that I no longer felt any anger. I just felt a profound sense of closure. "You told me 15 years ago that I was a disgrace," I said, my voice perfectly calm, cutting through the sound of the rain. "You threw me out into a storm just like this one because you thought my husband was beneath your social class. Now you are standing here with your life packed in garbage bags, begging a plumber and his wife for a roof over your heads." My father hung his head, sobbing quietly into his hands. "I am sorry, Jada," he wept. "We have absolutely nothing left. We are ruined." I reached into the pocket of my coat and pulled out a heavy ring of keys. I pushed them through the iron bars, letting them drop onto the wet pavement right at my father's feet. He looked down at them in confusion. "Those are the keys to your old medical clinic." "Dad," I said, "I officially bought the property from the bank yesterday morning, but it is not a medical practice anymore. I spent the last few weeks having my commercial crews completely gut the interior and remodel it. It is now a fully funded emergency shelter for runaway teenage mothers and girls who have been thrown out by their toxic families." My mother stared at me, her eyes wide with shock. A shelter? She whispered. Yes, a shelter, I replied. And the shelter needs full-time on-site maintenance staff. There is a small storage apartment in the back of the building with a bed and a working kitchenette. You and Mom can live there completely rent-free. But there is a condition. You will be the official janitors for the facility. You will scrub the toilets, you will mop the floors, and you will take out the trash for the exact kind of young, vulnerable girls you threw away 15 years ago. My father looked at the keys on the ground. He had spent his entire life looking down on manual labor. He had mocked Isaiah for working with his hands. And now the only way to save himself from sleeping on the street was to pick up a mop and clean toilets. It was the ultimate poetic justice. A punishment far more fitting than simple revenge. It was forced humility. He slowly bent down and picked up the keys, his hands shaking. "Thank you, Jada," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Thank you." I turned around and walked back up my driveway, leaving them in the rain to gather their trash bags and walk to their new life. I did not look back. 6 months later, our backyard was filled with bright lights and the sound of joyous laughter. It was Malik's 16th birthday party. The grill was smoking, the music was loud, and the yard was packed with people who genuinely loved us. Isaiah's family was there. Our corporate friends were there, and the community we had built from the ground up surrounded us with absolute warmth. I stood on the patio holding a glass of sweet tea, watching my son laugh with his uncles. Isaiah wrapped his arms around my waist from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder. "We did good," he murmured, watching Malik blow out the candles on his massive cake. "We did perfect," I replied, leaning back against his strong chest. I learned a very hard lesson in my life. People will tell you that blood is thicker than water and that you have to endure toxic abuse simply because someone shares your DNA. But that is a lie designed to keep victims trapped in a cycle of control. True family is not defined by biology or by a matching last name. True family is defined by the people who stand by you when you have absolutely nothing. It is defined by the people who build you up instead of tearing you down to protect their own fragile egos. They thought my husband's blue-collar job would disgrace the family name. But in the end, his calloused hands built a beautiful empire of love and respect, while their arrogant greed built their own perfect prison. I lost my biological parents at 18, but I gained the whole world. And looking at my beautiful son and my incredible husband, I know I am the richest woman alive. Thank you for listening to my story. If you ever find yourself walking away from a toxic family, remember that your real life begins the exact moment you decide you deserve better.